February 1945 dawned over the Crimean Peninsula with an air of anticipation and tension that few places on Earth had ever known. The world, battered and scarred by nearly 6 years of devastating conflict, now watched as the leaders of the three great Allied powers convened in Yalta to decide the fate of Europe and, by extension, the post-war world. From the ornate balconies of the WWII Palace, overlooking the calm expanse of the Black Sea, the three men Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin stood as symbols of triumph, exhaustion, and unrelenting determination. The stakes were enormous, Axis forces were crumbling, Germany teetered on the brink of total defeat, and the vacuum of power that would follow demanded swift and decisive action. Yet beneath the polished smiles and handshakes lay deep undercurrents of mistrust, divergent ambitions, and the fragile calculus of diplomacy in wartime. This gathering was not merely a meeting of allies, it was the shaping of a new world order, the kind that would reverberate for decades to come. Roosevelt arrived in Yalta with his health visibly declining, yet his resolve was unmistakable. His vision extended beyond the immediate defeat of Nazi Germany. He sought a post-war landscape governed by cooperation, law, and institutions that could prevent future global catastrophes. The United States, as he understood, would emerge from this war as a preeminent power, but wielding influence required negotiation, tact, and the delicate art of compromise. Across the table, Churchill brought the weight of a nation that had endured nearly 6 years of war, suffering the Blitz, and witnessing Europe's near collapse. He was determined to protect British interests, ensure the stability of Western Europe, and counterbalance the expansive ambitions of the Soviet Union. Stalin, commanding the Red Army that had borne the brunt of Nazi aggression, entered the palace with a quiet intensity, fully aware that the Soviet Union's sacrifice, millions of lives lost, cities reduced to rubble, gave him leverage, yet he also knew the Western Allies were necessary partners in the final phases of the war and the looming conflict against Japan. The stage was set for a confrontation of minds, egos, and visions. From the outset, the discussions revealed the intricate interplay of strategy, ideology, and pragmatism. Germany, though fractured and surrounded, remained the central concern. The three leaders debated its post-war treatment with vigor. Stalin demanded stringent security measures, including reparations and demilitarization, reflecting the staggering losses the Soviet Union had suffered. Roosevelt advocated for moderation, warning that excessively harsh measures could destabilize Europe and fuel resentment that might lead to future conflict. Churchill's approach was somewhere in between. While recognizing the need to weaken Germany, he also sought to preserve sufficient stability to prevent chaos in Central Europe. The eventual agreement to divide Germany into occupation zones, American, British, Soviet, and later French, was both a compromise and a practical acknowledgement of the Allies' control over the territory. Each zone would serve as a mechanism for reconstruction, oversight, and containment, yet the division planted the seeds for political tension that would later define the Cold War. Beyond Germany, the creation of an international organization to prevent future wars emerged as a shared priority. The leaders devoted considerable time to conceptualizing the United Nations, envisioning a body capable of mediating disputes, coordinating international aid, and maintaining peace in a world that had been torn apart by failure of diplomacy. Roosevelt, in particular, championed the UN as a means to institutionalize cooperation among nations, ensuring that the lessons of the League of Nations failure were heeded. Decisions regarding the Security Council, including the allocation of veto powers to the major powers, were contentious but crucial, reflecting the realities of post-war power dynamics. This framework, drafted amidst debate and negotiation, represented a commitment to collective security even as individual national interests shaped the precise contours of authority and influence. Yet while global governance could be planned, the fate of Eastern Europe revealed the fragility of alliance unity. The Red Army's advance had placed Stalin in a position of undeniable leverage, and his insistence on establishing friendly governments across Poland, Romania, and other territories created tension with Roosevelt and Churchill, who feared the imposition of authoritarian regimes. Negotiations over Poland, in particular, were heated. Roosevelt and Churchill sought assurances for democratic representation and the inclusion of the Polish government in exile, while Stalin insisted that the Lublin government, which he controlled, would form the basis of post-war administration. A compromise was reached: the pro-Soviet government would be expanded with members acceptable to the Western Allies, and free elections would be held at a future date. The language of compromise, however, masked a stark reality: Soviet influence in Eastern Europe was now virtually assured, and the Western powers had conceded both territory and political sway, a development that would later be viewed with criticism and apprehension. Amid these negotiations, Roosevelt also sought to secure Soviet participation in the war against Japan, recognizing that the Pacific theater would demand the full attention and resources of the Allied powers once Germany was defeated. Stalin agreed to enter the conflict within 3 months of Germany's surrender, a commitment that would play a pivotal role in hastening the end of hostilities in Asia. The discussions were layered and continuous, shifting seamlessly from European boundaries to Asian strategy, from reparations to political administration, each issue interwoven with others. Decisions about war crimes, the treatment of collaborators, and the administration of liberated territories reflected a broader understanding: victory in war must be accompanied by a framework for justice and reconstruction, lest chaos or revenge undermine peace. Throughout the conference, personal dynamics influenced outcomes as much as formal arguments. Roosevelt, leveraging charm and appeals to moral principle, sought to balance Stalin's demands with the Western vision of freedom and law. Churchill, steeped in historical caution and a sense of imperial responsibility, acted as both mediator and advocate for Britain's global standing. Stalin, shrewd and calculating, used the presence of his counterparts to extract concessions while projecting magnanimity and inevitability. Behind closed doors, the men negotiated, bargained, and occasionally clashed, but always with the awareness that the decisions they made would reshape continents, influence millions of lives, and set precedents for international relations. The tension between cooperation and competition was palpable, making each day of the conference a careful dance between diplomacy and strategy. As the days progressed, agreements began to crystallize. Germany's partition, reparations, demilitarization, and eventual denazification were codified, while plans for the United Nations were formalized in principle. Eastern European arrangements, though ambiguous in detail, reflected a blend of Western insistence on elections and Soviet insistence on security and influence. Commitments regarding the war in the Pacific, boundaries, and the treatment of Axis collaborators provided additional structure, ensuring that the conference's decisions extended far beyond Europe alone. By the conclusion of the week, the leaders had created a blueprint not only for post-war administration but also for a new international order, one that balanced competing visions yet reflected the realities of military and political power. The Yalta Conference, despite its diplomatic successes, was not free from controversy. Later critics would argue that Roosevelt and Churchill had conceded too much to Stalin, effectively allowing Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Yet at the moment, the agreements represented pragmatism in the face of military and political realities. The Red Army controlled the region, the Western Allies needed cooperation for the final stages of the war against Japan, and the devastation of Europe required immediate and coordinated planning. Each compromise, therefore, was calculated, a balance between principle, necessity, and survival in a rapidly changing world. The Yalta Conference had set the stage for the final months of World War II and the post-war reconstruction of Europe. The decisions made, whether regarding Germany, Eastern Europe, or global governance, were far-reaching, laying the foundation for decades of diplomacy, tension, and cooperation. The world, standing at the threshold of victory, now looked to these leaders not only to end the war but to create a peace that could endure, a challenge as formidable as any battlefield engagement. The sun set over the Black Sea, casting long shadows over the palace, and with it, the certainty that history was being written in those ornate halls, shaping the lives of millions and the destiny of nations. Negotiation, tension, and the fate of Europe. The palace corridors of Yalta hummed with quiet intensity as February 1945 unfolded. The war was nearing its end, yet the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, suspicion, and the immense weight of decisions that would reshape Europe. Each day brought new debates, subtle maneuvers, and delicate compromises as Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sought to reconcile their conflicting priorities. Outside, the Black Sea remained calm, almost mocking in its serenity, while inside, the leaders of the Allied powers engaged in a contest of strategy, ideology, and human psychology. This chapter of history was not written in gunfire or bombs but in conversation, negotiation, and the persistent struggle to balance morality with practical necessity. Germany, the epicenter of Europe's destruction, dominated nearly every discussion. The Allied leaders were unanimous in the belief that Hitler's regime must be dismantled, yet there were sharp differences on the method and aftermath. Stalin argued forcefully for reparations, insisting that Germany pay a price proportionate to the devastation it had caused, particularly to the Soviet Union. Roosevelt, while sympathetic to the losses suffered by the Soviets, warned that excessive reparations could destabilize the continent and sow the seeds for future conflict. Churchill, aware of Britain's economic vulnerability and the need for a stable Central Europe, negotiated a middle path. The outcome was a framework for Germany's division into zones of occupation, a decision that combined military practicality with political foresight. Each power would control a zone, enabling oversight, reconstruction, and security, while the establishment of a future democratic structure remained a long-term goal that required careful implementation. Eastern Europe emerged as the most sensitive and contested topic. The Red Army's advance meant that Stalin already controlled vast swathes of territory, yet the Western leaders sought assurances for political freedom and self-determination. Poland became the focal point of intense negotiations. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted the Polish government in exile to have influence in post-war governance, reflecting their commitment to democratic principles. Stalin, however, insisted that the Lublin Committee, loyal to the Soviet Union, would form the backbone of administration. The resulting compromise allowed the Lublin government to expand with representatives acceptable to the Western Allies, with elections promised at a later date. While presented as a gesture toward democracy, the arrangement effectively cemented Soviet dominance in Poland and signaled a broader acceptance of Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, a concession that would later be a source of controversy and a precursor to the Cold War. Tensions in negotiations were amplified by the different perspectives and personalities of the leaders. Roosevelt, despite frailty from illness, employed empathy, patience, and a keen sense of diplomacy. His goal was to achieve a lasting peace, recognizing that military victory alone would not secure stability. Churchill, experienced in the brutalities and politics of war, pressed for practical guarantees, often drawing on historical precedent to caution against overconfidence in promises. Stalin, with the Red Army controlling vast territories, approached the discussions with a calm but unyielding firmness, understanding that physical control of land translated directly into negotiating power. Each leader's approach shaped the conversation, with subtle gestures, strategic pauses, and pointed questions influencing the trajectory of agreements. The interplay of personality and power was as critical as the content of the discussions themselves. One area of major debate involved the administration of liberated territories and the broader question of post-war governance. The leaders recognized that political instability could invite chaos, economic collapse, or the resurgence of extremist movements. In this context, they discussed not only the structure of governments but also the mechanisms for economic recovery, infrastructure rebuilding, and population resettlement. Decisions regarding reparations, resource allocation, and territorial boundaries were deeply intertwined, requiring delicate balancing between justice, security, and feasibility. Roosevelt emphasized the importance of reconstruction as a preventive measure against future conflict, advocating for aid programs, coordinated governance, and international oversight where possible. The creation of the United Nations was another major focus, representing the Allies' desire to institutionalize peace and collective security. Here, the negotiations were as much about principle as power. Roosevelt championed the idea of a body that could intervene diplomatically to prevent conflicts, mediate disputes, and provide a forum for international cooperation. The Western leaders sought assurances that smaller nations would have meaningful participation, while the Soviets insisted on recognition of their security concerns and permanent influence in the new organization. After lengthy discussions, agreements were reached on the structure of the Security Council, the granting of veto power to the major powers, and the principles guiding the broader assembly. This institutional blueprint reflected both compromise and foresight, acknowledging the realities of post-war power dynamics while striving to prevent future catastrophes. Roosevelt also pressed for Stalin's commitment to enter the war against Japan following Germany's defeat. Stalin, aware that the European conflict had provided leverage in negotiations, agreed to join the Pacific theater within 3 months of Germany's surrender. This promise would accelerate the conclusion of hostilities in Asia and provided a tangible goal for Allied strategy. The discussion highlighted the interconnectedness of global theaters of war. Decisions made in Europe would directly influence military campaigns in the Pacific, logistics, and resource allocation. The leaders were not merely diplomats or politicians, they were wartime strategists shaping the trajectory of a global conflict through dialogue rather than bullets. Amid these discussions, the leaders also confronted the human cost of war. Millions of civilians had been displaced, countless cities lay in ruins, and survivors of concentration camps and military campaigns required immediate aid. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin each recognized that post-war reconstruction had a moral dimension as well as a strategic one. They debated mechanisms for providing food, medical care, and housing, as well as programs for returning refugees to their homelands. War crimes and accountability were addressed, foreshadowing the Nuremberg trials and the broader effort to codify justice for atrocities committed during the conflict. These conversations, often overshadowed by the more visible geopolitical issues, demonstrated an acute awareness that the human dimension could not be ignored if lasting peace was to be achieved. By midweek, agreements were taking shape, yet tensions lingered, particularly regarding the long-term political landscape of Eastern Europe. Stalin's insistence on Soviet security and influence contrasted sharply with Roosevelt and Churchill's emphasis on democracy and self-determination. Each concession required careful phrasing to maintain the appearance of shared values while accommodating strategic imperatives. For instance, while elections were promised in Poland, the timing, supervision, and scope were left deliberately flexible, giving the Soviets considerable leverage. This subtle balancing act illustrated the complexity of diplomacy at the highest level. Words mattered as much as deeds, and phrasing could determine whether agreements were honored or subverted. The human dimension of the conference, the personalities, the moods, and the interpersonal dynamics also played a significant role. Roosevelt's charm, experience, and moral framing often softened Stalin's rigidity. Churchill's historical knowledge and persuasive skill countered potential excesses. Stalin's careful calculation and quiet authority ensured that Soviet interests were respected. Together, these dynamics created an environment in which negotiation was both an art and a test of endurance, with every phrase, gesture, and strategic pause carrying weight far beyond the immediate room. The leaders were acutely aware that the outcome of Yalta would define not just military strategy but global political order for decades to come. The outlines of post-war Europe were beginning to emerge. Germany's division, the framework for Eastern European governance, plans for the United Nations, and commitments regarding Japan were all established in principle, though the details remained to be finalized. The negotiations reflected a blend of idealism and realism, morality and pragmatism, cooperation and tension. Yalta was more than a meeting, it was a crucible in which the ambitions, fears, and foresight of the Allied leaders converged to shape the future of a continent. The decisions made, and compromises reached, would influence not only the immediate post-war years but also the structure of international relations, the onset of the Cold War, and the lives of millions across Europe and beyond. Sealing the future, agreements and consequences *. The WWII Palace in Yalta, with its ornate halls and sweeping views of the Black Sea, had become the epicenter of a new kind of battlefield. No bombs fell here, no tanks rolled through the corridors, yet the stakes were no less monumental. As February 1945 progressed, the leaders of the United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union moved from tense negotiations to final agreements that would chart the course of Europe and the wider world. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had spent days testing each other's resolve, probing weaknesses, and extracting concessions, and now the conference entered its decisive phase. Each decision made, every phrase carefully chosen in communiques, carried the potential to shape the post-war balance of power for decades to come. The world watched, though few fully grasped the magnitude of what was being decided in those secluded chambers. The issue of Germany's reconstruction dominated the early hours of the final sessions. The leaders recognized that merely defeating Hitler's forces was insufficient. Germany's infrastructure, industry, and political institutions required deliberate oversight. It was agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, Soviet, and French, with Berlin itself similarly segmented. The zones were designed not only to administer control but also to monitor the demilitarization, denazification, and eventual rehabilitation of German society. The concept of reparations was carefully negotiated. Stalin demanded substantial compensation, citing the immense destruction the Soviet Union had endured. Roosevelt proposed a measured approach, emphasizing the need to avoid economic collapse, which could destabilize the continent and risk future conflicts. Churchill, ever pragmatic, sought a compromise that balanced Soviet security with economic feasibility. The resulting framework allowed the Allies to exact reparations while maintaining the conditions necessary for long-term stability, a delicate balance between justice and pragmatism. While Germany's fate was formalized, Eastern Europe remained the most contentious arena. The Red Army had already occupied significant territory, giving Stalin leverage that could not be ignored. Roosevelt and Churchill pushed for democratic representation and fair elections in nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Stalin, however, insisted on establishing governments sympathetic to Soviet interests, arguing that the lessons of Nazi aggression demanded a buffer zone to protect the Soviet homeland. The compromise was layered and nuanced. In Poland, the Lublin Committee, loyal to Moscow, would form the provisional government but would be expanded to include members acceptable to the Western Allies, and elections were promised at an unspecified later date. Across Eastern Europe, similar arrangements were made, effectively granting the Soviet Union a dominant political influence while maintaining the outward appearance of Allied cooperation. The subtlety of these agreements reflected the complexity of the era. Words were negotiated as carefully as territories, each phrase calibrated to preserve balance while acknowledging the distribution of power. A critical component of the Yalta discussions involved the establishment of the United Nations. Roosevelt's vision of a post-war world order centered on collective security and international cooperation. The three leaders agreed on the creation of a General Assembly and a Security Council, the latter endowed with veto powers for the major powers, an acknowledgement of both military realities and the political clout of the United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union. Smaller nations were promised representation, though the major powers retained influence sufficient to guide decisions. The conference laid the structural foundation for an organization capable of mediating disputes, coordinating humanitarian aid, and providing a forum for international law, signaling a conscious effort to prevent the recurrence of global conflict on the scale witnessed during the first half of the 20th century. The Pacific Theater, though geographically distant, also occupied the attention of the leaders. Roosevelt, fully aware that the war in Asia demanded coordinated action, sought Stalin's commitment to enter the conflict against Japan following Germany's surrender. Stalin, recognizing the strategic leverage provided by European dominance, agreed to invade Japanese-held territories within 3 months of Germany's collapse. This agreement would prove instrumental in hastening Japan's eventual surrender and demonstrated the interconnected nature of global strategy. Decisions made in Yalta would ripple across continents, influencing military campaigns, resource allocation, and diplomatic initiatives. Reparations and economic planning formed another cornerstone of the agreements. Beyond Germany, Europe faced the monumental task of rebuilding shattered economies, displaced populations, and devastated infrastructure. Discussions included mechanisms for distributing resources, coordinating reconstruction efforts, and ensuring food and medical aid reached affected regions. Roosevelt emphasized that sustainable recovery required careful planning, international collaboration, and investment in governance structures capable of fostering stability. Churchill and Stalin, while focused on immediate national interests, concurred on the necessity of a framework that would prevent famine, unrest, and potential uprisings in war-torn societies. The intersection of military victory, political strategy, and humanitarian concern became a defining feature of Yalta's legacy. Yet even as agreements were finalized, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Western Allies were increasingly aware that Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe could evolve into long-term influence, shaping politics, economies, and societies according to Moscow's priorities. Stalin, cognizant of his bargaining power, leveraged every opportunity to secure territorial and political advantage while presenting concessions as reasonable and necessary. Roosevelt and Churchill faced the delicate task of balancing immediate cooperation with the need to preserve future influence. These dynamics would sow the seeds of suspicion and rivalry, laying the groundwork for the ideological and geopolitical divides that would later crystallize into the Cold War. The Yalta Conference, in hindsight, can be seen not only as a meeting to plan post-war Europe but as a prelude to decades of tension and negotiation between East and West. The human dimension of Yalta also demanded attention. Millions of refugees, displaced persons, and survivors of Nazi atrocities required immediate aid. Discussions encompassed not only governance and military strategy but also humanitarian logistics, how to repatriate displaced populations, provide medical care, and restore livelihoods in devastated regions. War crimes and accountability were similarly addressed, with agreements that anticipated the Nuremberg trials and other efforts to prosecute those responsible for crimes against humanity. These discussions reflected an acute understanding that true victory in war extended beyond territorial conquest. It required justice, stability, and the reconstruction of societies shattered by conflict. As the conference drew to a close, formal communiques were drafted to encapsulate the agreements reached. Germany's partition into zones, plans for reparations, mechanisms for demilitarization, and provisions for denazification were all documented. Commitments regarding Eastern Europe, including Poland, Romania, and other territories, reflected a blend of Soviet security interests and Western democratic ideals, however tenuous the balance might prove. The United Nations framework was codified, providing both structure and legitimacy to the nascent international organization. Finally, Stalin's pledge to enter the Pacific Theater and the agreements on war crimes, displaced populations, and reconstruction ensured that Yalta's influence extended far beyond the European continent. The final days of the conference were marked by a cautious sense of achievement. Roosevelt, despite declining health, had secured a vision of a cooperative post-war world, albeit tempered by realpolitik. Churchill had protected Britain's strategic interests while negotiating compromises that balanced morality with practicality. Stalin had guaranteed Soviet security and influence in Eastern Europe, reflecting the sacrifices and power his nation had brought to bear during the war. The leaders left Yalta with a shared understanding: victory in the military sense was near, but the true challenge lay in translating that victory into a sustainable, just, and manageable peace. The decisions made in those corridors, couched in diplomacy and compromise, would shape political boundaries, ideological alignments, and international relations for decades to come. The contours of post-war Europe were largely defined. Germany was divided, reparations were scheduled, Eastern Europe's political landscape was outlined, and the foundation for the United Nations was laid. Commitments regarding Japan and humanitarian concerns were secured, and the human cost of war was acknowledged through planning for reconstruction and justice. Yet beneath these agreements lay a complex web of tension, suspicion, and competing priorities, an acknowledgement that the cooperation of allies in war did not automatically translate into harmony in peace. Yalta had achieved pragmatic solutions, but it had also created the conditions for future diplomatic challenges, signaling that the war's end would mark not only victory but the beginning of a new and intricate struggle for influence, security, and stability. Legacy of Yalta, a world remade and divided ***. As the last echoes of discussion faded from the ornate halls of WWII Palace, the world outside remained oblivious to the quiet seismic shifts underway. February 1945 at Yalta marked not only the negotiation of immediate post-war policies but the birth of a new international order whose effects would resonate for decades. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin departed the peninsula with agreements in hand, yet the implications of those agreements extended far beyond the Black Sea's placid waters. Europe, battered and exhausted, would soon discover that Yalta had remapped not just borders but the very principles governing sovereignty, security, and power. This final chapter examines how the conference's outcomes shaped the geopolitical landscape, sowed the seeds of the Cold War, and left an enduring imprint on global affairs. The immediate aftermath of Yalta saw the practical implementation of the conference's key decisions. Germany, once a singular aggressor threatening global stability, was now divided into 4 occupation zones. Berlin, the symbolic heart of the defeated Reich, mirrored this division, becoming a microcosm of broader Allied arrangements. Each zone operated under the administrative control of its occupying power, tasked with overseeing demilitarization, denazification, and reconstruction. The economic and political realities of this partition were immense. Factories had to be rebuilt, cities cleared of rubble, and civil governance restored. The agreements on reparations provided a blueprint for extracting compensation, particularly for the Soviet Union, which had endured unparalleled devastation. While these measures aimed to stabilize Europe, they also created friction, particularly as the Western Allies grew wary of Soviet influence expanding unchecked within its zones of control. Eastern Europe, however, revealed the more contentious legacy of Yalta. Stalin's insistence on establishing pro-Soviet regimes across Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary meant that the ideals of self-determination and democracy were often subordinated to strategic imperatives. Although elections were promised, the practical enforcement of democratic processes fell largely to Soviet oversight. Within months, governments sympathetic to Moscow assumed control, solidifying the Soviet sphere of influence. For Roosevelt and Churchill, this represented a compromise. They had secured verbal commitments to democratic processes but lacked the means to enforce them fully. The reality of Soviet military occupation combined with pre-agreed concessions effectively transformed Eastern Europe into a buffer zone, insulating the USSR from potential Western aggression but simultaneously creating an ideological divide. This subtle yet consequential arrangement planted the seeds for the Iron Curtain and the political polarization that would define the Cold War era. The Yalta agreements also had profound implications for the international system. The creation of the United Nations, envisioned as a forum for diplomacy and collective security, was formalized with the Security Council at its core. This new institution embodied a duality of ideals and pragmatism. Smaller nations were promised a voice, yet the major powers, the United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, China, and eventually France, retained veto authority, reflecting a balance between equality and realpolitik. In theory, the UN offered hope for a peaceful, cooperative world order. In practice, it mirrored the global power dynamics established at Yalta: collaboration where interests aligned, tension where they diverged. The United Nations would soon prove instrumental in addressing conflicts, providing humanitarian aid, and shaping international norms, yet its structure also ensured that ideological rivalry, particularly between East and West, would play out within its chambers. The Pacific Theater further illustrated Yalta's strategic foresight. Stalin's commitment to enter the war against Japan, timed within 3 months of Germany's defeat, had far-reaching consequences. Soviet military operations in Manchuria and other Japanese-held territories hastened Japan's surrender, complementing the United States' own campaigns in the Pacific. The conference thus demonstrated the interconnectedness of global strategy. Decisions made in the Crimean Palace influenced not only Europe but Asia and the broader balance of power in the post-war world. Roosevelt's diplomacy ensured Soviet participation while securing the promise of cooperation without ceding unqualified influence, a testament to his negotiation acumen even as his health declined. Beyond military and political arrangements, Yalta addressed the human and humanitarian dimensions of post-war reconstruction. Millions of displaced persons, refugees, and survivors of wartime atrocities required urgent attention. Mechanisms were agreed upon to repatriate populations, provide medical care, and restore basic infrastructure. Plans for addressing war crimes foreshadowed the Nuremberg trials and broader initiatives in international law, highlighting an emerging recognition that moral and legal accountability were integral to sustainable peace. These discussions underscored a critical truth: victory in war alone was insufficient. The restoration of societies and protection of human dignity were essential components of enduring security. Yet, as the months and years unfolded, Yalta's legacy became a subject of debate and controversy. Critics argued that Roosevelt and Churchill had conceded too much to Stalin, particularly in Eastern Europe, effectively allowing the Soviet Union to dominate nations that might otherwise have enjoyed political independence. From the Soviet perspective, these concessions were justified. The Red Army's sacrifice had been immense, the proximity of hostile powers demanded security buffers, and influence in neighboring countries ensured strategic depth. The differing perspectives of the Allies reflected not only immediate military realities but also deeper ideological divergences: Western liberal democracy versus Soviet authoritarian socialism. Yalta thus embodied the tension between cooperation and competition, a duality that would define the early Cold War. The political division of Europe quickly solidified into what would become known as the Iron Curtain. Nations in Eastern Europe operated under communist governments aligned with Moscow, while Western Europe, aided by initiatives such as the Marshall Plan, embarked on economic recovery and democratic consolidation. Germany, though divided, became a focal point of East-West rivalry, with Berlin serving as a flashpoint for tensions between occupation zones. These divisions, established in the aftermath of Yalta, shaped international relations for nearly half a century, influencing military alliances, diplomatic negotiations, and ideological confrontations worldwide. Yalta also left a lasting imprint on global perceptions of power and diplomacy. The conference demonstrated that major wartime alliances could accommodate both collaboration and distrust, that strategic necessity often outweighed moral imperatives, and that diplomacy in times of victory is as complex as the negotiations of war itself. The agreements crafted in WWII Palace were not merely documents, they were instruments for shaping the international order, reflecting a balance between immediate objectives and long-term consequences. Leaders of the post-war world, from Franklin Roosevelt to Winston Churchill to Joseph Stalin, understood that the decisions made in those days would resonate far beyond the shores of Crimea, influencing geopolitics, economics, and social structures in every continent. By the conclusion of the Yalta Conference, the world had been irrevocably altered. The foundations of post-war Europe were established: Germany's division, the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, the creation of the United Nations, and the framework for global cooperation all emerged from those decisive days. Yet embedded within these agreements were ambiguities and tensions that would surface as political realities evolved. Elections promised but controlled, borders drawn but contested, alliances forged but fragile all contributed to the complex legacy of Yalta. The conference achieved remarkable diplomatic outcomes, but it also highlighted the enduring challenges of reconciling national interests, ideological differences, and the human cost of global conflict. In retrospect, the Yalta Conference stands as a pivotal moment in 20th-century history. It bridged the transition from wartime alliance to post-war rivalry, from shared sacrifice to divergent strategic goals. The decisions made shaped the trajectory of Europe and the world, influencing everything from international law and humanitarian policy to the geopolitical fault lines of the Cold War. Yalta illustrated the delicate interplay of power, principle, and pragmatism, revealing that the end of a war marks not simply victory, but the beginning of a complex struggle to construct a lasting and just peace. As Europe slowly emerged from the shadows of destruction, the agreements forged in the Crimean Palace would serve both as a guide and a cautionary tale, a reminder that diplomacy and foresight are as critical to shaping the future as the battles that precede them.